Why are we here? And what does God want us to accomplish? That's why Paul, the Apostle Paul, wrote this letter we call 1 Timothy. In verse 16 tells us what the church is and what the truth is that the church supports. And it says this, "And by common confession, great is the mystery of godliness. He who was revealed in the flesh," speaking of Jesus, "was vindicated in the Spirit, beheld by angels, was proclaimed among the nations, believed on in the world, taken up in glory." And so each one of those are statements of Jesus, of who Jesus is, saying something about Jesus. And it says the church is about godliness. Look at verse 16 there. It says, "By common confession, great is the mystery of godliness." Godliness is a mystery. And the church shares a common confession of the great mystery of godliness. And that common confession is Jesus. Without Jesus, there's no true church. And first of all, Jesus is the truth that supports the church. He says that the household of God is the church, and the church is the pillar and support, or pillar and foundation of the truth. And then he breaks into this psalm of praise, or perhaps it was an early doctrinal statement, a creed or a hymn that was repeated. We don't exactly know, but it's in kind of that poetic hymn-like format. And so there's three terms here in our text that are components of the church. So we'll take these in reverse order. It says godliness, there's a mystery, and confession. Three things. First of all, godliness. When I think of godliness, I think of God-likeness. Godliness. The characteristics that are like God. Not to say that we become God, but we become like Jesus. There are communicable characteristics of God. God is loving. We can become loving. God is patient. We can become patient. God is merciful. God is just. God is righteous. All of those things are characteristics and traits of God that God revealed to us through Jesus that we can become. God-likeness. This term is not the first time we find it in 1 Timothy. If you go back to 1 Timothy chapter 2, after telling us to pray for those in authority over us, he says in verse 2 of chapter 2, "In order that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness." Godliness and dignity. So there's a relationship between our submission to authority and godliness. If you go down to verse 10, he's addressing women, and starting in verse 9, and he says, it's not about what's on the outside, but what's on the inside. They're to put on by means of good works as befits women making a claim to godliness. Godliness. God saves us to make us godly, like Him. Many of the texts that talk about foreknowledge and predestination and calling and choosing, they emphasize that God has foreknown us, called us, predestined us to be like Jesus, to be conformed to the image of His Son. Not just give us a ticket to heaven, but to make us like Jesus, that we demonstrate His glory in the world around us. If we lack godliness, if we lack Christ-likeness to the same degree that we lack, we fail to uphold the truth of God. Have you ever noticed somebody says, I'm a Christian, and you look at their life and their life is a lie? They're like, I don't see the truth of God in your life at all. 2 Peter, he speaks about godliness as something that God gives us. In 2 Peter chapter 1 verse 3, he says, God's divine power has granted to us everything pertaining to life and godliness. God has given us everything we need for life and godliness. It's a gift of God. So you can say, well, where does godliness come from? Well, God gives it to us, indeed. But if you just keep reading a few verses later, he says, now for this very reason, applying all diligence, and then he gives us a list. Applying all diligence, add this to this, add this to this, add this to this, build. And he says, applying all diligence in your perseverance, supply godliness. And in your godliness, supply brotherly kindness. And so here in the same context, God has given us everything we need for life and godliness, but we have to be diligent to supply it. Which is true. Yes, God gives it to us, but we have to supply it. How can we, knowing and honest of who we are and what we're like, make a claim to godliness? And how can God, by His grace, take the righteousness of Jesus and put our sin on Him and give us the righteousness of Jesus? How does that happen? It's like Nicodemus, This grown man, and Jesus says, you got to be born again to enter the kingdom of heaven. He's like, I'm thinking about this, and I don't know how that'd work. How can a man, when he's old, be born again? It's a mystery. We sometimes sing that song, I don't know how God does this. I don't know how God does that. I don't know how the Spirit of God works in people's lives, convicting them of sin. What's the name of it? I know whom I have believed. That's how we say that in the song anyway. There's some things we know, and there's some things that are just a great mystery. It's speaking here, great is the mystery of godliness. It's a mystery. Godliness is a mystery. There is this wonderful, marvelous, inexplicable work of God. A mystery that takes a detestable, wicked, self-centered sinner and transforms him into a kind, loving, sacrificing, serving, gentle man of God. Thank you for listening.